Hi, everyone. Well, we've made it to Wednesday. It's hump day, I guess, right? We're halfway through the week. You should probably have a sense now of how fast an online course moves in J-term. If you haven't taken one before, it is pretty quick moving. So we're already halfway through the first week. At the end of the week, we're down to maybe 2 weeks. So things are moving along well. But I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing from a lot of the things that you're writing and posting, and the quizzes look good. And I hope you're enjoying it. I will probably be posting an anonymous poll at the end of this week for you to look at over the weekend, so that I can do a little bit of evaluation in real time to see if you think I need to make any adjustments to anything in the course, and kind of get a sense of what you think is working and what isn't. But hello, welcome to Wednesday. So I've got a few things I want to talk about briefly. Again, I don't want to keep you here for any more than a half an hour. So let me run over some things. So the first thing I want to just say is I want to reflect a little bit on some of the comments that I was seeing from the content on Tuesday on dealing with the labor question. And the one issue that came up a lot, that a lot of people mentioned, both in the quizzes and in forum posts and things like that, was this issue of violence. And I just wanted to clarify my perspective on this, or what I think is maybe a bit of a misunderstanding or misperception that some people had. It's true that there was often violence around these strikes in the late 19th century. The Pullman strike is one example. The Haymarket, obviously. The Homestead strike is the one I was thinking of. However, I think that some people got the impression that the strikers themselves were the main instigators of violence. And I just want to kind of clarify what usually happened in the 19th century is that a strike would be called and workers would picket. There would often be pretty strict injunctions against strikers using violence. What happened is that as the days went on, oftentimes either public officials like the police, or if it got really serious, the National Guard, or sometimes private contractors, basically private armies. Some of them came from private detective agencies like the Pinkerton Agency, would be hired by the company to police the grounds. And it was usually, the violence would usually occur when there was some sort of conflict between either police and National Guards people, or between the private guards and strikers. In other words, it wasn't that strikers were necessarily launching violence. Actually, it was much more common that strikers would be the victims of violence. And it's also worth keeping in mind that a lot of companies would hire what were called so-called agents provocateurs, in other words, spies, to infiltrate strikes and to create incidents that would then create a pretext that would justify a police or National Guard use of violence. This is actually what investigators found was happening during the Pullman strike, that much of the violence that was happening during the Pullman strike was the result of artificially created scenarios by the employers that drew National Guard and ultimately federal troops in, that escalated the violence. This is one of the reasons that 1902 coal strike that I asked you about in the quiz was so important, because prior to that intervention, which set a precedent that we'll later see play out in the New Deal, the government was not a neutral arbiter. One of the reasons that that's so important is because the role of government prior to that strike had basically been to show up when things were already getting tense, and that's why you would have so much violence. So the notion of having the government as a sort of a neutral rule setter and arbiter was a major sort of breakthrough in labor relations. So I just wanted to make that point. Okay, so I have 3 short points that I want to make for today's sources and for today's issue. And then I've got one more thing just to say to prepare for tomorrow. So I've got 4 points that I'm going to make briefly, shortly. 3 dealing with today, and then 1 looking forward to tomorrow. I would also think that we're probably about the time in the week, again, we're moving really fast, but we're probably at about the time where you can start to think about going back and looking at what other students are posting in your forums and thinking about what kind of responses you might make, or thinking about in the news posts. I've had one student so far um, noticed something that came up that struck them as being interesting. I would think if you were looking for issues like economic inequality or immigration, you're probably seeing things. I'm thinking that you're seeing some things that should correspond with other things that you were looking at in the news stories. Some of that should be resonating, I would think, with some of the things that we've been looking at yesterday and today. So you might think about whether or not you do see those connections. And it's quite interesting from my perspective in the forum, the daily forums, like the forum on interpreting Indian photography and yesterday's forum on the labor question. If you go back and look at them in almost all of the forums that you're in, you are actually in disagreement with other students in your group. So there is something to talk about. And most people have had solid posts that are very reasonable and that are clearly assessing both sides of the issue, but where people are sort of coming out and saying, well, I like this thesis better, and another person is saying, I like this thesis better. Those disagreements are there. So if you go back and you look at it, you're probably about at a point where you could respond to someone who picked the thesis other than yourself and have an explanation or a discussion about how you each sort of came to your decisions. So there is a conversation that can start to be happening. Okay, so the three things for today. The first thing I want to just briefly mention are the additional links that I have put on Moodle for today. So those three links refer to first, it's a link to a museum in New York City, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. The second is a link to what's basically an encyclopedia entry for a college at a college in Virginia that describes the Hull House, which if you've done the reading for today, I think you understand the Hull House is a settlement house in Chicago that sort of played a major role in progressive reform. And then the third link is a link to a source that is produced by the Online Encyclopedia of Chicago. And that source is a map that was produced by Hull House. I just want to briefly explain what these are and how you might use them. They're not required with the exception of the Tenement Museum, but let me just say a little bit about them. So the link to the Tenement House Museum it's intended to allow you to start to actually see what the physical life of an immigrant enclave would look like. This is an excellent museum, which was created in the 1980s, in the 1990s. If you're ever in New York City, I really encourage you to go. I went a couple of years ago. If you can't get there and you have a smartphone, you can download an app called Google Expeditions. And if you download that app, it's a virtual reality app. So whether or not you have a VR player or not, if you have a smartphone, you can still download this app, Google Expeditions, and you can take a virtual tour of this. It will sort of walk you through different rooms of the Tenement Museum. So if you're really interested in sort of seeing physically what the conditions were like in a late 19th century tenement, this particular tenement was in the Lower East Side, the heavily Jewish area of immigrant New York. Actually, the painting that we have posted on Moodle for today, it's a painting of the neighborhood that is from the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. So there's a connection there. The specific link will take you to some archival sources and will show you some snippets of some oral histories. I thought that was a good link because it corresponds with the sources that you're looking at and going to the source for today, right? In other words, we're just sort of adding additional immigrant voices for you to be thinking about as you're composing your forum posts. So that's how you might think of that source. The second link is basically if you just want to know a little bit more about the Hull House. It's a short entry. It's the equivalent of maybe 2 pages, and it has a few images. So if you were reading going to the source and you see all these references to Hull House and you're a little bit unclear what it is, this is a link that just gives you a little more basic information about that. And then the third source, I'm not requiring, but I'm encouraging you to click on that link. And what you'll need to do is kind of run your cursor over the image because it will be really small on your screen. And when you do that, you should be able to see a tab that says toggle full screen. Once you do that, the image will come to the full screen and you'll be able to zoom in and zoom out. What this source is, it's very typical of what Hull House did. Hull House saw themselves both as a providers of social services, but also as almost a kind of social research organization. They saw themselves as being investigators of the city and as conducting a kind of being something of a laboratory in social urban living. By being a laboratory, meaning we're going to combine different elements of our city, like the immigrant poor and the middle class and all of these other people, to kind of figure out how we can live together in these new urban environments, but also a laboratory in ideas that might generate policy for urban reform. And one of the ways that they did that was to take very, very detailed studies of the neighborhood that Hull House was in. And what that link will take you toward is a map of the neighborhood of Hull House. And each individual dwelling in the several square blocks that surround Hull House in Chicago was coded according to which ethnic group lived there. So what you can do is zoom in on that map and play around on it, and you can see in extreme detail all of the different ethnic groups and where they were in relationship to each other and in relationship to Hull House. If you take that and put that next to the tour of the Lower East Side tenement, even though they're in two different cities, you're kind of able to say, okay, here's what this world looks like from the perspective of settlement house workers, and here's what it looks like from the perspective of their immigrant clients. So that's what those three sources can be linked for. I want to briefly talk a little bit about how historians have dealt with the settlement house movement and progressivism in general. And I'm just going to say just a brief word about this before moving on to sort of the last point about the sources. But I just wanted to kind of give you a sense for how historians have thought and researched the settlement house movement. The basic line of interpretation on the impact and the role of the settlements, it tends to fall into one of two camps. There's one group of historians who's argued that people like Jane Addams and things like Hull House and the settlement house movement was essentially conservative. In other words, these were people who were really nervous and worried about the seeming disintegration of social order that what had been brought about by the Industrial Revolution and this wave of immigration. And they sort of saw themselves as the best. They saw their form of middle-class Protestant American culture as more or less superior to the culture of the immigrants. And they were very worried about immigrants becoming radicalized. And so they formed these settlement houses as a way of enforcing a kind of social control and bringing some sort of order to the city. The other major way of interpreting this is, I think, more charitable and sort of optimistic, and sees people like Jane Addams as a genuine humanitarian reformer figure, as someone who is motivated by Christian socialism and humanitarianism and is figuring out new roles and identities for women and new roles and identity for the city, and is really interested in all sorts of interesting experimentation and will ultimately become a major champion of social justice. I will just say personally, I'm more inclined to be won over by that second interpretation than the first one. Although it's true that people like Jane Addams were really nervous about social order and they did fear radicalization, I still think, Jane Addams is the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And that's for good reason. I think that her work amongst immigrants, she was certainly more willing to approach people the way they actually were and to learn from others than the average American of her time. And so personally, I would say she gets credit for that. Okay, the last point that I want to make about the sources for today is that you might start at this point to be thinking comparatively about the different types of sources that we're seeing in the Going to the Source book. So far, we've seen photographs, we've seen newspapers, and now today we're seeing memoirs. Now, in my experience, having taught this book a few times, This is tends to be one of the most popular chapters with students, and I think I understand why. It's because you're able to connect with the real person. A real person is telling their story to you. And that's it really draws you in as a reader. It feels easier to read. Um, what I would ask, though, is do you think that a memoir is a quote unquote better or a more authentic or a more reliable source than some of the other sources that we have seen? Let's put it this way. If you had to build an interpretation based on photographs, newspapers, or memoirs, which would you say is the most reliable source or the most reliable depiction? Um, the advantage that a memoir has, of course, is that it is a person telling their own story in their own words. And this is surprising. You might be surprised at how rare this is in history, but most people don't leave a record of what they actually think about events that affect them. And so we're often left with trying to sort of read between the lines of sources that are talking about people and figuring what did they think about it. Well, these memoirs give us a sense of what immigrant women actually thought and felt about their experience and about their encounters with middle class social workers. So that's to the advantage. On the other hand, they're really removed in time from the events that they're talking about. This is the great advantage of something like a newspaper, right? The newspapers at the beginning of the Pullman strike, they don't know that they're reporting on an event that is soon going to become a major historical event. They're just reporting on the news. They're just reporting on a strike. It's not until the event is over and the federal investigators come in that it becomes clear that what just happened is going to be really important. But they don't know that at the time that the event happens. Now, a memoir of the Pullman strike is going to be written with that knowledge in the person's head that whatever, let's say we were reading the memoir of a Pullman worker instead. Well, that worker is going to be looking back. It is going to be filtered through the experience of the way that the strike ended. It's going to be filtered through all of the experience of the labor movement and probably socialism since then. And all of that might be shaping the memories or the ways that the memories are reconstructed in the story itself in a way that a newspaper account that's unfolding in real time or a photograph that was taken at the time or a series of photographs don't have. So memoirs are great, but it's worth keeping in mind the way that memory can be selective, the way that when you think about what audience is going to be reading it, what do you want to say to that audience? How much of yourself do you reveal? You might think about your own social media profile. How much of that is really you? How much of that is curated? And if you went back to talk about yourself, the you that existed 5 years in the past, how much of the you that you talk about today would be the same as the you that recorded 5 years ago, if that makes sense. So those are some of the issues that you might think about with these sources. Okay, that's pretty much what I wanted to say in relation to the sources for today. I just want to end by giving you some things to think about for what we're looking at tomorrow. Largely because there are a couple of optional sources. So when you get to it, I want you to be prepared so that you sort of know what to do with it. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about African Americans in this period from about the 1880s to about the 1920s. So they're going to give us a bit of a preview for where we'll be going next week, because then we're going to wind back to the 1890s on Friday. But in talking about African American life, I think we really have to take it from about the 1880s to the 1920s. And so the sources that you're going to see on the top of the page for tomorrow, the first 2 or 3 of those are optional, but again, they can be really useful. One is a link to an interactive map of American lynchings. This is a very dark period that we're going to be talking about. It's very grim. The amount of violence directed against African Americans because they were African Americans is shocking. And the violence was often brutal. But if we want, one of the ways of thinking about that is to think about it in space. So where were the majority of lynchings at different times? What that link does, it gives you an interactive map so that you can sort of explore the landscape of racial violence at the time. One of the other links is this is quite optional, but I think that some of you will be interested in it, especially if you're interested in the history of art. So there was an African-American artist named Jacob Lawrence who painted a series of paintings in the mid-20th century, and the series is known as the Migration Series. And that refers to this incident that historians refer to as the Great Migration, the movement of African Americans from the South to the North that begins around the time of World War I. And Lawrence has maybe 60 different paintings. He's sort of seen as the official artist, African American representator or artist of the Great Migration. These are very famous paintings. They're wonderful. So if you're interested in seeing how an African American artist is interpreting African American history, that's what that link is there for. The one other link that I wanted to mention is I just posted a link. This is a new link that I just posted today. It's to a Prezi presentation for when I would teach this class in person. So this is not a perfect source because normally I would be there describing what's going on in it. But in general, this is a source that is going to, it has certain images of American advertising. And the reason that I posted it is because the sources that you'll look at in going to the source come from an African-American journal, and they are basically advertisements. And I think it could be very instructive to compare the way that companies that were selling to whites used African-Americans in their advertisements versus the way that African-Americans presented themselves when they were advertising products to themselves. I think it's really important to have that comparison in mind in order to make sense of what you're seeing and going to the source. So you can explore the images in that PowerPoint or Prezi, and we can talk a little bit more about that. The last thing of the link that you'll see, there is an additional video to watch for tomorrow. It's from a PBS series called Many Rivers to Cross. Henry Louis Gates is the host of this series. I believe the episode is like an hour long, though I might be misremembering that. But you will want to watch it before you take the quiz, because there are questions in the quiz that cover both the video lecture and the Many Rivers to Cross video. So there's a little bit of additional viewing for tomorrow. Also, I would say that the sources and going to the source are, I think you'll want to tune in tomorrow because some of them are a little bit hard to read. I definitely want to say some things about them. Okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and send me an email. I haven't seen anybody try to stream any questions here. So I don't know if that's not working or if you're just not interested. But I will be back tomorrow and we will have a conversation again at that time. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.